Hi, thank you for being here at the Young Force. I'm Natalia Fumero, your host, and today we're going to be covering why and when to use a trigger versus a batch, and when is it sufficient to just run an anonymous script. And we're going to cover a little bit of the differences, some of the limitations. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Okay, so let's break this down by categories, why don't we? So, the first thing that I want to do is think of ruling out code always. First is best practice. In Salesforce, we want to avoid number one, if you're a developer, you want to avoid having to write more code to test your code. And the wonderful thing about flows is you don't have to have a test class for it. Some people would argue that that's not necessarily all that safe, but at the very least, you can ensure that process won't stop you from going live, unlike if you write an actual trigger or batch or anything else like a class. However, a lot of the times, having solutions like that, like a flow or formula, will come across certain limitations. And one of those, out of experience, I could tell you, for example, is that a flow can be a lot more difficult to debug than a class, even. You can't just write system debug on your flow, for example. So if you seem to have a lot of processes that clash with one another, debugging can be very difficult in that case for flows. And that might be a good reason to jump into a trigger. Another reason is there already a trigger written in the object that you're trying to create more code for or more processes. In that case, then best practice is absolutely to stick to the trigger class that's already written and kind of just expand on that one. If there's a trigger already, then use trigger. If not, try flow first. Flow, or maybe if there's already a process builder that's existing, I would go with that first. Now, another question is, do we need to do it every time a user saves the record? If yes, then trigger is good. So triggers really only fire when an event occurs inside of the instance. You can't really do this. You can't really schedule a trigger. It's kind of the one constraint that it has, that time doesn't quite matter. So it really can only get fired either by call out coming in, incoming processes like an email, or again, when any kind of record gets inserted, updated, deleted, any of those, or undeleted. So I'll just write that here as well. When inserted, updated, deleted, undeleted. This always has to start from the object that is getting inserted, updated, deleted, or undeleted. Let's say you're receiving an email and you want a process to fire from there, then you would have to work from the email object. Now, when is a good time to use a batch? Well, do we want to update historical records? If that's the case, then sure. Why do I suggest a batch? A lot of the time, we all kind of forget that the historical data was already there. And of course, the whole idea is if you're adding a new field that should have logic and should kind of display the correct way, depending on what else is going on with the record or perhaps the related records, just by creating the trigger, those will not get updated. Can we do that with a flow? Unfortunately, no. You could, there is an alternative to this, just update data via data loader. And I insist on data loader and not the import wizard, the data import wizard, because you're probably already hitting somewhere above, I think it's 20,000 or 50,000 records. If you are trying to do a batch, probably, maybe not, but it could be data loader or data import wizard, where you would just go back and update all of the records on that object that you're trying to update, or the related object, and then as you could just either fire these updates that will then trigger the trigger, or you could just actually make the changes that you're trying to do to historical data. Another reason to use a batch limits. So here's a good time to talk about governor limits. A lot of the times for certifications, you will have to have these memorized, and I kind of have some of them kind of memorized, perhaps by the 200s, and I know the 50,000 of the SQL queries that you can retrieve because they are the ones that I kind of access or have to worry about the most usually. But the good thing is that Google is always your friend. So let's really quickly cover some of the governor limits, and this is something that you can absolutely benefit from kind of passing over and over whenever you get a chance. So there's two things in here to take into account, that there is limits for synchronous transactions versus asynchronous transactions. Say if you are having, for example, a future method, you get a little bit more leeway on things like how many SQL queries you can issue. But for the most part, they're pretty similar. So I will say, for example, if you're not running a batch, you have to worry about the most is going to be how many SQL queries you're issuing, how many records you are retrieving, either by the query locator, and the DML statements issued, which is going to be 150. And this is if you're running a class or trigger, because each transaction is only going to allow you to do this. In a batch, you're actually running little transactions and you can bite size how many you're doing. So perhaps you're doing 50 at a time, but you are going to hit a lot more. In fact, you could do an entire org of I've done orgs with over 60,000 accounts with a batch, for example. So back to knowing now what limits are, let's go back to this. If I know that I'm going to have to update perhaps related records that are going to be too many of them, I can foresee this and then perhaps suggest a scheduled batch instead. This is in the case that you have a process that needs to continue to happen, not just a one-off, right? So if you're wanting to update all of these records that are just too many of to do in one transaction, you can maybe then do this daily, or I think you could do it a couple of times a day, but at the very least, you could do it daily or weekly or monthly. Schedule a batch and kind of get the job done without running into errors. All right, so for our final part of this video, I want to talk about the anonymous window. A fantastic use for the anonymous window is to create test data so that you can work better, understand really how your process is working. Perhaps you don't have all of the permissions via the UI, so bypass permissions. And you can also delete data that you just can't see, delete records that you want to massively or basically delete all of your records that you maybe created test. Some examples that I can think of off the top of my head. But another important use of the anonymous window is that you get to run the script to call your batches. And that's very important. So I'm going to leave you here with the script to run the batch. So this is the format of a batch script. It's going to be the batch name BC. A lot of the times you will find it to be something like batch name BC, semicolon, and then you will call BC on the next one. And you're going to pass it its own name, the name of the instance that you created. And you can do one more thing, and this is very important. You can actually specify how big the batch size should be. The default is actually, I believe, 150 or 200. And many times you will get an error. Your batch will not succeed because there are too many processes happening at once. And you can actually fix this a little bit by shortening or making the size of the batch smaller. So you could say something like 50. So only grab 50 records at a time, or even 10 or less, anywhere in between those 150, and testing it out that way. And with that, we're going to close today's video. I hope you guys learned something new. And I would love to hear about issues you've had with triggers and batches in the past, how you solve those. I'll catch you guys on the next video. Thank you so much.